Welcome back, or just welcome if you're new here. I'm Common Free. I'm an employment relations practitioner, and I'm also the owner and director of Free Employment Relations. I have included a list of my credentials in the description box below to give you some peace of mind around the content that I share. Today's video is all about maternity leave. I thought that would be fun to make given that I recently-ish had a baby. Also for today's video, stay tuned until the end because I've decided to include some free resources and templates. My disclaimer for today's video is my usual disclaimer. I share a lot of information in these videos, but I'm not able to address every exception or every nuance. If you need further assistance, please contact a professional. My second disclaimer for today's video is that I'm addressing maternity leave as it's detailed in the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. So if your industry is governed by a sectoral determination or by a collective agreement through a bargaining council, you have a main agreement, collective agreement, then you can still watch this video, but just take the information in this video and then check your sectoral determination or your collective agreement to see if there are any variations that apply to your business or your industry. First thing about maternity leave is that the legislation details the minimum requirements. So often I will hear statements like, an employer must give X period of time. The actual correct way to phrase that is an employer must grant a minimum of that period of time, and they can, at their discretion, give more favorable terms, so give a longer period of time. They just can't give less than what the legislation says. Where in the legislation can you find maternity leave if you want to look it up for yourself? Maternity leave is detailed in the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, Chapter 3. Chapter 3 relates to leave, so if you ever need to look up anything about leave, Chapter 3, Basic Conditions of Employment Act. Specifically, we're talking about Section 25 today. Who is this not applicable to? This section is not applicable to employees who work less than 24 hours in a month. How long is maternity leave in South Africa? Maternity leave is a minimum of 4 consecutive months. A frequently asked question I get is there a minimum period of time that an employee needs to work for a particular employer to become entitled to maternity leave? No, they do not. This is different for other types of leave. So for example, sick leave, annual leave, family responsibility leave, employees need to work a minimum time period to become entitled to that leave. That is not the same for maternity leave. An employee does not have to work a period of time to become entitled to maternity leave. That being said though, the payment might be impacted if the length of service with a particular employer is shorter or the time that the employee has contributed to the unemployment fund is shorter. I will get to payment a little bit later in this video. Next question. Must an employee inform an employer if they are pregnant? Yes and no. No, you don't have to run out and inform your employer the moment you find out that you are pregnant. You also don't need to include that information in an interview, with some exceptions. The exception to this is if in the interview you know that you're pregnant and your pregnancy is going to impact your ability to fulfill the requirements of the job, then you will need to disclose that information, because an employee cannot accept a job where at the onset or commencement you're aware that you can't actually fulfill the requirements of that job. Examples of this may include if the job requires physical activities that you would not be able to do safely while pregnant, or if you need to work with chemicals that would not be deemed safe to work with while pregnant. Aside from that, if the pregnancy is not going to impact your ability to fulfill the requirements of the job, you don't need to disclose that information. But next question about notifying the employer is, when does an employee need to notify an employer about their pregnancy? Of course, for practical reasons, it might be best to inform your employer as soon as possible, but that's not a legislative requirement. The legislation says an employee needs to inform an employer in writing if the employee can write. If they can't write, then they can just inform the employer verbally. And when? At least 4 weeks before the intended commencement of maternity leave. So 4 weeks before an employee plans to take their maternity leave. The exception to this is if it's not practicable to do so, then an employee needs to inform an employer as soon as possible. So there are times that due to unforeseen circumstances, an employee might need to start their maternity leave sooner, and they might not be able to give that 4 weeks notice. What does an employee need to tell an employer? Firstly, when they intend to start their maternity leave, so the start date, and secondly, when they intend to return from maternity leave. When can an employee start maternity leave? Firstly, within 4 weeks of the expected date of birth. So that's within 4 weeks of the typical due date. Typical due dates are at 40 weeks pregnant. Secondly, if an employer and an employee agree to a different date. And thirdly, if a midwife or a medical practitioner deems it necessary for an employee to take their maternity leave, possibly a little bit earlier. Some random fun information about my case is that Elbow was born at 40 weeks and 6 days, and only about 4% of babies are born on their due date. Then the return date. There are some considerations that an employee and an employer need to take into account when determining the return date. So some people like to take off earlier so that they can prepare for the birth, but what needs to be considered is that an employee is not allowed to return to work within 6 weeks of having given birth. The exception to this is if a medical practitioner or a midwife deems that the employee is fit to return to work within a shorter time period. Now, the reason for this is because the 6 weeks post-birth is a very critical time for a woman to recover from birth, as well as to bond with her newborn baby and establish breastfeeding and other important things. In my case, I honored the first 40 days. This is a practice that is more common in different cultures, but I've linked down below a book on it. And in my case, I believe that it made a major difference to my transition into parenthood and then my ability to return to work later on. A next frequently asked question is, does an employee get leave if they've had a miscarriage or a stillborn? If an employee had a miscarriage in the first or second trimester, they are not entitled by legislation to maternity leave. But that being said, if an employee had a miscarriage in their first and second trimester and they go to see a medical practitioner, it is likely that the medical practitioner will book them off for sick leave. The medical practitioners I've spoken to, typically, if there are no complications with the miscarriage, will book an employee off for 1 week. Again, this will be sick leave and not maternity leave. So this sick leave will come off the sick leave entitlement and will be paid by the employer. It works differently to maternity leave. The next point is, if an employee has a miscarriage or a stillborn in the 3rd trimester, they are entitled to 6 weeks of maternity leave. So the legislation phrases it as a miscarriage or a stillborn in the 3rd trimester. My assumption for the inclusion of both of these is because sometimes the definition of the 3rd trimester and or a stillborn differs, but the most widely used definition of a stillborn is a loss that occurs after 28 weeks pregnant. Also, the most widely used definition of the 3rd trimester is that it starts at 28 weeks pregnant. Now, the reason that an employee would be granted maternity leave if they had a loss in their 3rd trimester is again because it's likely that the birthing process will require more physical time to heal, as well as the time off for the emotional process. In some cases, 6 weeks might not be enough, but in those circumstances, an employee approach a medical practitioner for them to be granted sick leave in addition to the maternity leave. Final question, is maternity leave paid? Not by the employer, no, unless an employer chooses to do so at their discretion. Payment for maternity leave in South Africa works through the unemployment fund. An employee will get maternity leave benefits. The amount that an employee gets is determined by the minister from time to time, so it is a percentage of the employee's salary, but there's also a cap. I would suggest that you look up what the latest information is to try to determine more or less the payment that you will receive. And that brings us to the end of today's video. I have other videos that I will do on this topic around questions that I frequently get asked, like whether an employer can fire a pregnant woman, or what to do if a company is going through the retrenchment consultation process and some employees are on maternity leave. I will also cover parental leave, but I do have a video already that details family responsibility leave. But please let me know in the comments below if you have any specific questions that you would like me to address in future videos. Now for the free resources, I have linked down below some wording that employers can use for the contract clause for maternity leave, and I've also left a link to wording below that an employee can use to inform their employer of when they would like to take maternity leave and when they're going to return from maternity leave. If you like this video and found this information useful, please give this video a like, and remember that if you subscribe, it assists me to keep making this content for you.